Picture this: the most powerful women in the world, gathered in a castle that floats among clouds, deciding which kings will rule, which wars will end, and which child will be forced to marry a stranger to produce an heir they can control from birth. Now imagine that one of these women, the leader, would eventually have her eyes slowly cut out by a king she once controlled like a puppet. And here's the twist that changes everything. Centuries after her torture and execution, she would be worshipped as a saint. This is the true story of the Lodge of Sorceresses. Tonight, we are venturing deep into the most secretive, most manipulative, and most tragically misguided organization in all of Witcher lore. You think you know about secret societies pulling strings from the shadows? The Lodge of Sorceresses makes the Illuminati look like a book club. These women didn't just influence politics. They attempted to breed a dynasty, control the most powerful being on the continent, and reshape civilization itself according to their vision. And every single one of them would pay a terrible price for that ambition. What makes their story so compelling isn't that they were evil. What makes it haunting is that they genuinely believed they were saving the world. They saw the chaos, the endless wars, the incompetent rulers leading millions to slaughter, and they thought, we can do better. We have the power, we have the intelligence, we have the right to make these choices because no one else can. They were wrong, but understanding why they were wrong, how their noble intentions curdled into something monstrous, and what their ultimate fate reveals about power itself is a journey worth taking. So settle in, get comfortable, because we're about to explore a conspiracy that spans decades, involves some of the most brilliant minds in the Witcher universe, and ends in fire, blood, and a martyrdom that rewrites history itself. The Fall of the Brotherhood. To understand the Lodge of Sorceresses, we must first understand what came before. Long before these women gathered in secret, there existed another organization, one that had guided and controlled magic across the northern kingdoms for centuries. This was the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, and its collapse would create the conditions for everything that followed. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers was founded in the aftermath of the Novigradian Union in the 8th century, a monumental agreement that established a non-aggression pact among the fractured kingdoms of the north. Magic users had always existed, scattered and independent, answering to no authority but their own considerable powers. But the formation of the Brotherhood changed that. For the first time, mages united under a common structure, creating a hierarchy that would regulate magical practice for generations to come. The Brotherhood's governing body was known as the Chapter of the Gift and the Art, later evolving into two main councils: the Conclave of Mages and the Supreme Council of Sorcerers. These bodies established the rules that all practitioners of magic were expected to follow. They outlawed what they termed black magic, practices like necromancy, demonology, and artifact compression. Violators faced severe consequences, often imprisonment in dimeritium shackles for centuries, or expulsion from the Brotherhood entirely, branded as renegades. The Brotherhood controlled the great magical academies. Aretuza, the prestigious school for sorceresses on Thanedd Island, fell under their jurisdiction, as did Ban Ard, the academy for male mages. Rissberg, another important magical institution, also operated under Brotherhood oversight. Through these schools, the Brotherhood shaped new generations of mages, instilling in them not just magical knowledge, but also the political and social philosophies that would guide their actions. But beneath the polished surface of regulation and order, the Brotherhood harbored deep fractures. The organization was supposedly neutral, advising kings and queens with impartial wisdom. But in truth, neutrality proved impossible. Mages were not emotionless automatons. They held allegiances, harbored ambitions, and pursued personal agendas that often conflicted with the Brotherhood's stated mission of serving the greater good. Some mages believed their gifts elevated them above ordinary humans, that their understanding of the arcane arts made them the rightful stewards of civilization's future. Others saw magic as a tool to be wielded carefully, always in service to those who lacked it. Still others viewed the Brotherhood's restrictions as limitations to be circumvented, quietly pursuing forbidden research in hidden laboratories like the one at Rissberg, where even the most prohibited experiments continued behind closed doors. The greatest rift emerged between those who supported the Northern Kingdoms and those who saw opportunity in the rising power of Nilfgaard to the south. The Nilfgaardian Empire was expanding relentlessly, conquering territory after territory with military precision and political cunning. Emperor Emir var Emreis was a master strategist, and he understood that controlling mages meant controlling the flow of information, the outcomes of battles, and the very fabric of reality itself. Nilfgaard began recruiting mages to its cause, offering them status, wealth, and freedom from the Brotherhood's restrictions. Some joined willingly, seduced by promises of power. Others were coerced, threatened, or manipulated into service. The result was a Brotherhood deeply divided, with loyalties split between North and South, between idealism and pragmatism, between those who believed in the institution and those who saw it as an outdated relic. This division came to a violent head on the night between June 30th and the morning of July 1st in the year 1267, during what would become known as the Thanedd coup. The Brotherhood had convened one of its Grand Mages' conclaves on Thanedd Island, a gathering meant to address the escalating tensions with Nilfgaard and chart a course forward. The island's location made it ideal for such meetings, isolated and protected, accessible only by portal. A grand banquet preceded the formal proceedings, an evening of celebration where mages from across the continent mingled, exchanged pleasantries, and discussed matters both trivial and profound. But beneath the veneer of civility, conspiracy brewed on both sides. Here's something that might surprise you. The Thanedd coup wasn't started by the Nilfgaardian faction. It was started by Philippa Eilhart herself. Philippa had been investigating reports of mages secretly allied with Nilfgaard. She had compiled a list of suspects, individuals she believed were betraying the Brotherhood's supposed neutrality. Among them were Vilgefortz of Roggeveen, a charismatic and ambitious sorcerer whose true loyalties remained unclear, and Francesca Findabair, the beautiful elven sorceress, whose sympathies appeared to lie with the Empire. What Philippa didn't fully realize was that Vilgefortz and the Nilfgaardian faction had been planning their own coup, intending to strike during the conclave. Both sides were preparing betrayal. But Philippa struck first. She convinced other northern-aligned mages, including Sigismund Dijkstra, to help her arrest the suspected traitors before dawn, before the official conclave could even begin. It was a bold move, a direct challenge to the Brotherhood's authority, and it would shatter the organization beyond repair. The arrests began in Garstang, the interrogation chamber beneath the island's surface. Vilgefortz, Francesca, and others found themselves in magical bonds, facing charges of treason against the Brotherhood and the Northern Kingdoms. But Philippa had made a critical miscalculation. She hadn't accounted for how deeply the conspiracy ran, nor how prepared the Nilfgaardian faction was for confrontation. Tisaya de Vries, one of the Brotherhood's most respected members and the headmistress of Aretuza, confronted Philippa about the arrests. Tisaya believed in due process, in careful deliberation, in the Brotherhood's ability to resolve disputes through reason rather than force. The two sorceresses argued fiercely, their voices echoing through the stone chambers. In a moment of frustration, or perhaps moral uncertainty, Tisaya made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her brief life. She removed the magical barrier protecting Thanedd Island, hoping this would force a more civil resolution between the two factions. What happened next was carnage. The Nilfgaardian-aligned mages, freed from their bonds, immediately attacked their captors. Spells lit the darkness with deadly brilliance. Flames consumed ancient tapestries. Stone shattered under the force of magical duels. And then Francesca Findabair, the elven sorceress, made her move. She opened the cellar doors beneath the hollowed island, and Scoia'tael forces poured through the entrance. These elven guerrilla fighters had been secretly transported to Thanedd by Cahir Mar Dyffryn Ep Sialach and others working for Nilfgaard. They had been hiding in the island's depths, waiting for this exact moment. Now they joined the battle, their arrows and blades cutting down northern mages and Redanian soldiers alike. The corridors and chambers of Thanedd became a labyrinth of death. Mages who had spent their lives studying together, teaching together, now fought each other with lethal intent. Vilgefortz revealed his true colors. He was not merely allied with Nilfgaard. He was pursuing his own agenda, one that involved capturing Ciri, the young girl with elder blood who had become the focus of so many schemes and prophecies. During the chaos, Vilgefortz confronted Geralt of Rivia, the Witcher who had been drawn into these events through his connection to Ciri. The fight was brutally one-sided. Vilgefortz shattered Geralt's bones with contemptuous ease, leaving him broken but alive, calling the encounter a little lesson before disappearing into the night. Young Ciri found herself pursued through the labyrinthine corridors. She fought off Cahir in a desperate sword duel, her training under the Witchers serving her well. Then she fled through a portal, vanishing into time and space, her whereabouts unknown. By dawn, Thanedd Island was a graveyard. Dozens of mages lay dead. Redanian soldiers who had stormed the island to restore order found themselves battling both Scoia'tael and rogue mages. The Tower of Gulls, a structure housing young students, had exploded during the fighting, though whether by accident or design remained unclear. Tissaia de Vries, overcome with guilt at her role in the catastrophe, would later take her own life, unable to bear the weight of what her actions had enabled. And Philippa Eilhart fled. She had started the night believing she was protecting the Brotherhood. She ended it having destroyed it. In the aftermath of the Thanedd coup, confidence in mages collapsed across the northern kingdoms. Kings and nobles who had once relied on magical advisors now viewed them with suspicion and fear. Many mages found themselves expelled from royal courts, their councils disbanded, their advice no longer sought. The Brotherhood of Sorcerers, that ancient institution that had guided magical practice for centuries, dissolved into scattered factions and personal vendettas. A power vacuum had formed, and into that vacuum would step something new, something more focused, and far more dangerous. The Lodge of Sorceresses was about to be born. Birth of the Lodge. Several weeks after the blood had dried on Thanedd's stones, according to the historical record, the Lodge held its first meeting. The exact timeline isn't entirely clear from the books, but we know from various sources that the organization came together sometime in early August of 1267, roughly a month after the coup. Philippa Eilhart stood in the grand hall of her castle, Monte Calvo, preparing to host a gathering that would reshape the political landscape of the continent. The castle's name meant beautiful mountain in the ancient tongue, and it lived up to that description. Perched high in the peaks, surrounded by clouds, Monte Calvo was nearly impossible to reach without magical aid, making it perfect for a meeting that needed to remain absolutely secret. Philippa had spent those weeks carefully considering what came next. The Brotherhood was dead, or as good as dead. The structures that had regulated magic for centuries lay in ruins. But Philippa was not one to mourn what was lost when opportunity beckoned. She saw in this chaos a chance to create something better, something more effective, something that could actually accomplish what the Brotherhood never had: true influence over the course of history. She had sent carefully worded invitations to specific sorceresses, women she knew possessed not just magical power, but also the intelligence, cunning, and ruthlessness that would be required for what she had in mind. Not all who received invitations accepted immediately. Some had reservations, some needed persuading, but eventually they came. The first meeting of what would become the Lodge of Sorceresses took place in Montecalvo's council chamber. Present in physical form were Philippa herself, Triss Merigold of Maribor, Keira Metz of Carreras, and Margarita Lozantil, the rector of Aretusa. Appearing as magical projections, their bodies safely elsewhere, were Sabrina Glevesig of Ard Carai, Sheala de Tancarville, Francesca Findabair, and Asira var Anahid. The gathering began with tension thick enough to cut. Francesca had supported Nilfgaard during the Thanedd coup. Asaya was a Nilfgaardian sorceress through and through, loyal to Emperor Emir. Their presence among sorceresses who had fought on the opposing side at Thanedd created an atmosphere of distrust and barely contained hostility. Philippa addressed this immediately. She made it clear that the organization she envisioned would not be bound by the old divisions. Individual members could maintain whatever political allegiances they chose. Francesca could remain Queen of Dol Blathana, ruling under Nilfgaardian authority. Asaya could continue serving the Emperor, but the Lodge itself would operate independently, pursuing goals that transcended any single kingdom or empire. This declaration was revolutionary. It acknowledged that the old pretense of neutrality had been a lie, but rather than try to resurrect that lie, Philippa proposed something more honest. An organization where differing viewpoints coexisted, bound together by a shared belief in the supremacy of magical knowledge and the necessity of magical practitioners shaping civilization's future. The sorceresses deliberated on what their organization should be called. Various suggestions were offered and rejected. It was Sheala de Tancarville, a scholarly sorceress, who had initially been reluctant to join, who proposed the name that would stick. The Lodge, she said simply. Like the Brotherhood before it, but different. A lodge suggested something more intimate, more selective. Not an open brotherhood, but a closed circle. The name was adopted. Philippa then revealed her vision for the lodge's structure. She believed in the mystical significance of the number 12, seeing it as representing perfection and completeness. The lodge would have 12 members, no more, no less. Currently they numbered 8. 4 more would need to be recruited carefully, sorceresses whose abilities and ambitions aligned with the lodge's goals. At the second meeting, held several weeks later, 3 new members were inducted. Asira var Anahid brought with her Fringilla Vigo, another powerful Nilfgaardian sorceress who had connections throughout the Empire's court. Francesca Findabair arrived with 2 additional elven sorceresses. Ida Emian Ape Sivni, whose knowledge of elder blood and ancient magics was unparalleled among her people. The 12th and final seat would be offered to Yennefer of Vengerberg. Yennefer was an obvious choice in many ways. She was powerful, widely respected, and most importantly, she had a close relationship with Cirilla of Cintra, the young girl whose elder blood made her the focus of so much attention. Having Yennefer in the lodge would provide a direct connection to Ciri, something Philippa and the others very much desired. But here's the dark truth that would only become clear at the second meeting. Yennefer wasn't being invited to join the lodge. She was being recruited to help them control Ciri. The entire invitation was a means to an end, and Yennefer would see through it immediately. Yennefer had always been fiercely independent. She had never fit comfortably within the Brotherhood's structures, and she was deeply suspicious of any organization that sought to control or manipulate. When Philippa revealed the Lodge's intentions regarding Ciri at that second meeting, Yennefer's response was unequivocal. She refused to participate in using the girl as a political tool. During the meeting, as the other sorceresses outlined their plans to arrange Ciri's marriage and control her future children, Yennefer simply stood, opened a portal, and walked through it, leaving the lodge with only 11 members. Her departure was telling. It revealed the fundamental tension at the heart of the lodge's mission. They genuinely believed they were working for the greater good, that their intelligence and magical abilities made them uniquely qualified to guide civilization away from the brink of destruction. But they were also willing to sacrifice individual freedom and choice to achieve those goals, to use people as pieces on a board, to make decisions they believed others were incapable of making wisely. This would be both the Lodge's greatest strength and its fatal flaw. The Lodge's stated purpose was clear and high-minded. They would protect the interests of magic in a world increasingly hostile to mages. They would work to end the war between the Northern Kingdoms and Nilfgaard, believing that continued conflict served no one's interests. They would promote stability, order, and progress. They would ensure that magical knowledge was preserved and advanced, not lost to the flames of war and persecution. But behind these noble aims lay a more ambitious goal, one that Philippa articulated clearly to her sisters in the lodge. They would rule, not openly, not with crowns and thrones, but through influence and manipulation. They would place their people in positions of power throughout the continent. They would guide kings and queens like puppeteers working strings. They would make the crucial decisions that shaped history, and they would do so from the shadows where no one could stop them. To accomplish this, they needed to control not just the present, but the future. And that meant controlling those who would inherit the world. That meant controlling Ciri. The Lodge's vision for Ciri was complex and carefully planned. They knew she possessed elder blood, the genetic legacy of the elf Lara Dorren, which granted her extraordinary powers over time and space. They knew that prophecies spoke of a child of the elder blood who would either save or destroy the world. They knew that every major power, from Nilfgaard to the Northern Kingdoms to the elves themselves, wanted to control her destiny. The Lodge's plan was elegant in its simplicity and horrifying in its implications. They would arrange for Ciri to marry Prince Tancred Tyson, heir to the throne of Kovir and Povis, one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the north. Through this marriage, Ciri would become queen. The child she bore would inherit not just the throne, but also her elder blood, her extraordinary powers. And this child would be raised by the Lodge, educated in magic, groomed from birth to rule as they dictated. But here's what makes this plan even more disturbing. When the Lodge finally confronted Ciri about this in the books, they didn't just propose a political marriage. They told her she would need to become Tancred's lover, seduce him, make him fall hopelessly in love with her so he would do anything she asked. They would teach her how to manipulate him emotionally, how to use her position as his beloved to control his decisions. The child wouldn't just be the product of a dynastic marriage, it would be the product of calculated seduction orchestrated by a cabal of sorceresses who believed the ends justified any means. And if Ciri refused? If she showed reluctance or resistance? The books suggest the Lodge had contingency plans. There are dark references to Vilgefortz's method. He had wanted to use magical means to impregnate Ciri, bypassing her consent entirely. The Lodge assured Ciri they would never do anything as crude as that, positioning themselves as the lesser evil. But the very fact that they brought it up, that they used it as a point of comparison, reveals how deeply twisted their thinking had become. It was, in their minds, the perfect solution, a magical dynasty that would bring stability to the continent, a ruler with power beyond imagination, guided by wisdom beyond measure. The age of pointless wars and petty squabbles would end, replaced by an era of enlightened rule. They never stopped to consider that Ciri might have her own ideas about her future, or that Geralt and Yennefer would fight to protect her, right to choose her own path, or that their entire elaborate scheme rested on the assumption that they, and only they, knew what was best for the world. The meetings at Monte Calvo continued. The sorceresses planned and plotted. They discussed how to manipulate events to their advantage. They debated which kingdoms needed their attention, which rulers could be influenced, which threats needed to be neutralized. And through it all, Philippa Eilhart guided their discussions, her sharp mind always 3 steps ahead, her will imposing order on what might otherwise have descended into chaotic disagreement. But already, cracks were forming. Not all members of the Lodge were equally committed to its goals. Triss Merigold, young and idealistic, found herself increasingly uncomfortable with some of the Lodge's methods. She had joined believing they would protect magic and promote peace. She had not signed on for the level of manipulation and control that Philippa seemed to envision. And there were others beyond the Lodge who would not simply accept this new order. Yennefer might have refused to join, but she had not forgotten what the Lodge intended for Ciri. Geralt of Rivia, once he learned of their plans, would become an implacable enemy. And Ciri herself, when she finally discovered what these sorceresses intended for her future, would make her own feelings on the matter devastatingly clear. The Lodge of Sorceresses had been born from the ashes of the Brotherhood. But like many things born from fire, it would eventually burn those who thought they could control it. The architect, Philippa Eilhart. If the Lodge of Sorceresses was a grand design, then Philippa Eilhart was its architect, the mind that conceived it, the will that shaped it, and the power that sustained it. To understand the Lodge, one must understand Philippa, for she was, in many ways, its living embodiment. Brilliant, ruthless, utterly convinced of her own righteousness, and willing to pay any price to see her vision realized. Philippa was born in Redania around the year 900, which made her more than 300 years old by the time the events of the Witcher saga unfolded. But like all sorceresses, she had arrested her aging through magic, maintaining the appearance of a woman in her prime. She presented herself with meticulous care, always dressed impeccably, her black hair perfectly styled, her makeup applied with precision. She favored masculine clothing, doublets and leather jackets. But for formal occasions, she would don elaborate gowns decorated with diamonds and ermine fur. Her appearance was calculated to project power and confidence. Nothing about Philippa was accidental. Every gesture, every word, every expression was chosen for effect. She wore black agate jewelry, her favorite stone, but also understood the value of adapting her presentation to different audiences. She used perfume blended with cinnamon and musk, a distinctive scent that lingered in rooms after she left. But it was not her appearance that made Philippa dangerous. It was her mind. Philippa had studied at Aretusa under the legendary Tissaia de Vries, and even Tissaia, who had taught countless powerful sorceresses, considered Philippa among her finest students. Philippa's magical talents were prodigious. She excelled at virtually every school of magic, from destructive spells to subtle enchantments to complex ritual work. But her true gift was polymorphy, the rare ability to transform her physical shape. Most mages could create illusory disguises or temporarily alter minor features. True polymorphy was far more difficult and dangerous. It required not just transforming the body, but maintaining that transformation over extended periods, all while keeping one's mind intact. Very few sorceresses could manage it. Philippa could, and she had chosen her alternate form with typical calculation. A large grey owl. The owl was perfect for her purposes. It allowed her to travel unnoticed, to perch in places where humans could not go, to observe conversations from windows and rafters. An owl in a castle drew no particular attention. Nobles and servants alike would glance at it and think nothing of it, never realizing that behind those avian eyes lurked one of the most dangerous minds in the continent. Philippa had gathered countless secrets in her owl form, intelligence that she used to devastating effect in her political maneuvering. Her political career began in Redania, one of the most powerful kingdoms in the north. She became advisor to King Visimir II, a position that gave her enormous influence over Redanian policy. But Philippa was never content to merely advise. She wanted to rule, even if she could never wear the crown herself. So she ruled through Visimir, guiding his decisions, shaping his policies, and gradually accumulating more and more power at the Redanian court. Her relationship with Sigismund Dijkstra, the kingdom's spy master, was complex and multifaceted. For a time they were lovers, though Philippa's true preference was for women, a fact she made little effort to hide. She used her relationship with Dijkstra strategically, maintaining his loyalty and cooperation even as she manipulated him. Dijkstra was intelligent and cunning in his own right, one of the sharpest minds in the north, but he was never quite Philippa's equal. She stayed several moves ahead of him in their intricate dance of alliance and betrayal. And then there's the matter of King Visimir's death. Here's where we enter murky territory, because the books never explicitly state what happened. But the circumstances are damning. Visimir died during the Thanedd coup, assassinated on the same night that changed everything. The timing was remarkably convenient for Philippa. With Visimir dead, Redania fell under the control of his young son Radovid, a boy who could be more easily influenced and controlled. Did Philippa arrange her own king's murder? The evidence is circumstantial, but those who knew her well had little doubt. She had the motive, the means, and the ruthlessness. And in the chaos of Thanedd, with mages dying left and right, and loyalties fracturing across the continent, one more dead king drew less attention than it might have otherwise. If she did have Visimir killed, this would prove to be one of her greatest miscalculations, planting the seeds of her own eventual destruction. Because Radovid was not the puppet she believed him to be. This would prove to be one of her rare miscalculations. Radovid was intelligent, perceptive, and he learned early to hate and fear the sorceress who dominated his childhood. From the moment he was a child, Philippa had coddled and demeaned him, treating him as a puppet rather than a future king. She would even go so far as to sign royal edicts on his behalf, exercising power that should have been his. Radovid never forgot this humiliation. When he eventually came to power, truly came to power in his own right, his hatred of Philippa would extend to all mages, and he would orchestrate witch hunts that would claim the lives of hundreds of magic users, including Philippa herself. But that dark future still lay ahead during the early days of the Lodge. Philippa's role in the Thanedd coup demonstrated both her capabilities and her limitations. She had correctly identified that the Brotherhood was compromised, that mages allied with Nilfgaard posed a threat to the northern kingdoms. Her decision to act, to arrest the suspected traitors, came from genuine conviction that she was protecting her homeland. But she failed to anticipate how prepared the Nilfgaardian faction was for confrontation. She didn't realize that Vilgefortz had been playing a deeper game than anyone suspected. She didn't account for how her actions would fracture the Brotherhood beyond repair, and in the chaos she helped unleash, Ciri vanished, setting in motion a desperate search that would consume the next several years. The formation of the Lodge represented Philippa's attempt to learn from the Brotherhood's mistakes. She believed the Brotherhood had failed because it tried to be too many things to too many people. It attempted neutrality when true neutrality was impossible. It included too many members with conflicting agendas. It operated with rules and structures that prevented decisive action. The Lodge would be different. It would be small, elite, unified in purpose. It would not pretend to neutrality, but would instead embrace the reality that its members had different loyalties, finding strength in that diversity rather than being weakened by it. And it would not shy away from doing what needed to be done, no matter how ruthless those actions might appear to outsiders. Philippa envisioned the Lodge as an organization that could outlast any single member, that would continue shaping history long after she was gone. She wanted to create something that would matter, that would make a difference, that would be remembered. In this, she was not so different from any other person who seeks to leave their mark upon the world. But Philippa's mark would be written in manipulation and blood. Her plan for Ciri exemplified her approach. She genuinely believed that raising a child of the elder blood to rule, guided by the Lodge's wisdom, would bring peace and stability to the continent. She could not see, or chose not to see, the fundamental arrogance in assuming that she and her fellow sorceresses had the right to make that choice for Ciri. She could not imagine that there might be value in letting people choose their own destinies, even if they chose poorly. This blindness to her own overreach would ultimately doom the Lodge's grand designs. But in the early days, as the sorceresses gathered at Monte Calvo and Philippa outlined her vision, that doom still seemed distant and unlikely. They were powerful. They were brilliant. They were united in purpose. What could possibly go wrong? The answer, as it turned out, was everything. But that knowledge lay in the future. For now, Philippa Eilhart stood at the center of her web, pulling strings across the continent, confident that she could shape the world according to her vision. And for a time, it seemed like she might actually succeed. The idealist, Triss Merigold. Among the founding members of the Lodge, Triss Merigold stood apart. Where Philippa calculated, Triss cared. Where Francesca manipulated, Triss hoped. Where others saw the Lodge as a tool for accumulating power and influence, Triss saw it as a chance to protect magic and promote genuine good in a world torn by war. She was, in many ways, the Lodge's conscience, its moral center, and that role would place her in an impossible position as the organization's true nature revealed itself. Triss was born and raised in Maribor, a city in the kingdom of Temeria. Unlike many sorceresses whose origins lay in nobility or wealth, Triss's background was more modest. She discovered her magical abilities at a young age, during what mages called a conduit moment, that first instance when raw magical power manifests uncontrollably. Recognized by local sorcerers as having potential, she found her way to Aretusa, the prestigious academy where she would be transformed from a girl with gifts into a fully trained sorceress. At Aretusa, Triss specialized in the creation of magical potions, particularly healing elixirs. This focus on healing magic was both deeply characteristic of her compassionate nature and somewhat ironic, given that Triss herself was allergic to magical potions. A cruel twist of fate left her unable to use the very medicines she could create. She could only tolerate non-magical remedies, and so she learned to carry amulets and other magical items that could substitute for the potions her body rejected. Triss was young, at least by the standards of sorceresses. She was only around 30 or 40 years old during the events of the Witcher saga, whereas most of her peers in the Lodge had lived for centuries. This youth manifested in her appearance and demeanor. Where older sorceresses often projected cold sophistication and careful control, Triss retained a warmth and spontaneity that made her seem more human, more approachable. She had chestnut brown hair, though in some accounts it appeared auburn or even reddish, and her face still showed the genuine emotions that more experienced sorceresses had learned to mask. But youth should not be confused with weakness. Triss was powerful, her magic formidable, and she had proven her courage and commitment in the most terrible crucible imaginable. the Battle of Sodden Hill. The Battle of Sodden Hill was the climactic confrontation of the First Northern War between the Northern Kingdoms and the Nilfgaardian Empire. 22 mages took the field that day, standing against the full might of Nilfgaard's army. They were determined to hold Sodden Hill, to prevent the Empire from breaking through into the heart of the North. And hold it they did, but at a terrible cost. 13 mages died that day, or so it was believed. Triss fought with everything she had. She unleashed flames upon the advancing soldiers. She maintained shields that deflected arrows and spells. She healed wounded soldiers even as battle raged around her. And then, in the chaos, she was caught in an explosion of magical fire. Her body was burned, her hair scorched away, her face and chest scarred by flame. She collapsed, presumed dead among the other fallen. A memorial was erected at Sodden Hill, an obelisk bearing the names of the 13 heroic mages who had sacrificed themselves for the North. Triss's name was engraved upon it. She became known as the 14th of the Hill, a title that acknowledged both her presumed death and her miraculous survival. She had lived, but barely. The physical scars would fade with magical healing, but the emotional trauma of that day would remain with Triss forever. The Battle of Sodden Hill shaped Triss in profound ways. It taught her the true cost of war, the reality of sacrifice, the weight of loss. She had watched friends and fellow mages die, had seen firsthand how political conflicts translated into actual bloodshed and suffering. This experience instilled in her a deep commitment to preventing future wars, to finding ways to resolve conflicts without such terrible violence. This commitment made Philippa's vision for the Lodge deeply appealing to Triss. Here was an organization dedicated to ending the war, to creating stability, to using magical power not for destruction, but for protection. Triss joined the Lodge believing she was part of something noble, something that would make the world better. Her relationship with the other members was complex. She was friends with Yennefer of Vengerberg, though that friendship was complicated by Triss's feelings for Geralt of Rivia. In the books, Triss had once used a magical charm to seduce Geralt, a deeply questionable act that reflected her desperation and poor judgment rather than any malicious intent. Geralt had firmly rejected her afterwards, establishing clear boundaries, but Triss had never entirely let go of her feelings for him. This connection to Geralt, and by extension to Ciri, would become increasingly significant. Triss had spent time at Kaer Morhen, the Witcher's mountain fortress, helping to care for young Ciri during her training. She had been like an older sister to the girl, teaching her about magic and the wider world. Ciri had trusted Triss, had looked up to her, and that trust would make the Lodge's plans for Ciri all the more troubling to Triss's conscience. Within the Lodge, Triss found herself in a difficult position. She was one of the youngest members, and therefore one of the least experienced. In the hierarchy that naturally formed, she ranked below sorceresses like Philippa, Francesca, and Margarita, women who had centuries of political maneuvering behind them. Triss's voice carried less weight in their deliberations, her objections more easily dismissed. And she did object. As the Lodge's true agenda became clear, as Philippa outlined their plans to control Ciri's destiny, Triss felt growing unease. She believed in protecting Ciri, yes, but not in using her as a pawn in some grand political scheme. She believed in ending the war, but not through manipulation and forced marriages. She believed in the Lodge's stated ideals, but increasingly doubted whether those ideals matched their actual actions. Yet Triss remained silent. This silence was perhaps her greatest failure, the choice she would later regret most deeply. When Yennefer contacted the Lodge via Megascope, desperately seeking help to rescue Geralt and find Ciri, Philippa refused, and Triss, standing right there beside Philippa, said nothing. She did not speak up for her friend. She did not challenge Philippa's cold calculation that helping Yennefer was not in the interests of the Lodge. Why did Triss stay silent? The answer was complex. Partly she feared Philippa's wrath. Philippa did not tolerate defiance, and Triss had seen what happened to those who opposed the Lodge's leader. Partly she doubted herself. Who was she, young and inexperienced, to question the judgment of sorceresses who had lived for centuries? Partly she still clung to the hope that the Lodge's methods, however troubling, would ultimately lead to a better world. But mostly, Triss stayed silent because it was easier than speaking up, and that ease came with a terrible cost. The Lodge's plans moved forward. They searched for Ciri, intending to implement their scheme to marry her to Prince Tancred. They manipulated political events across the north, always working toward their vision of a mage-guided future. And Triss participated in these efforts, even as doubt gnawed at her heart. It was only near the end, during the final book of the saga, that Triss found her courage. When the Lodge finally confronted Ciri directly, when they tried to convince her to accept their plans for her future, Ciri's reaction was explosive. Her powers flared out of control, driven by anger and fear. And in that moment, witnessing Ciri's pain and Ciri's refusal to be used, Triss finally understood the full weight of what the Lodge had been trying to do. Later, when given one final chance to speak up, Triss surprised everyone, including herself. The Lodge was debating whether to allow Ciri one last meeting with Geralt before implementing their plans. Most members wanted to refuse, to keep Ciri isolated and under their control. But Philippa, in a rare moment of mercy or perhaps calculation, cast the deciding vote to allow it. And Triss, who could have opposed this, who could have sided with the hardliners, instead remained silent, tacitly supporting Philippa's decision. That silence, after so much previous silence, was perhaps Triss's moment of redemption. She could not undo the harm the Lodge had done or her own complicity in their schemes, but she could give Ciri this one thing, a chance to see the family she loved, even if it meant the Lodge's plans might unravel. And unravel they did. Ciri never returned to the Lodge. After the events in Rivia, where Geralt was mortally wounded in a pogrom and Yennefer sacrificed herself trying to save him, Ciri took them both away to a place only she could reach. The Lodge's grand design, their carefully laid plans, their vision of a mage-guided future all collapsed in a single moment. In the years that followed, particularly in the events depicted in the Witcher video games, Triss would undergo a transformation. She became more confident, more willing to stand up for what she believed in. She led mage uprisings. She worked tirelessly to protect non-humans and magic users from persecution. She became, in many ways, the idealistic hero she had always wanted to be, but had been too afraid to embrace during the Lodge's existence. But she never forgot those days at Monte Calvo, those meetings where terrible decisions were made, and she had stayed silent. Triss Merigold carried that guilt forward, letting it shape her into someone better, someone braver, someone who would never again put loyalty to an organization above doing what was right. She was the Lodge's conscience, and in the end, that conscience condemned them all. The Elven Queen, Francesca Findabair. In the halls of Monte Calvo, among sorceresses renowned for their beauty, one woman stood apart. Francesca Findabair was not merely beautiful. She was, by widespread consensus across the continent, the most beautiful woman in the world. Her looks were legendary, spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. Poets wrote verses attempting to capture her perfection and found their words inadequate. Artists painted her portrait and despaired at their inability to do justice to reality. To see Francesca was to witness something that transcended normal human attractiveness, something that approached the divine. She had long golden hair that seemed to capture and hold sunlight, wearing it in elaborate styles befitting her royal status. Her eyes were the azure blue characteristic of pure-blooded elves, but harder and more inscrutable than glass, constantly ringed with the provocative elven makeup that made them even more striking. Her features were perfect, symmetrical, timeless. She moved with grace that made others seem clumsy in comparison. When she entered a room, conversations stopped. When she spoke, people listened, captivated as much by her presence as by her words. But Francesca Findabair was far more than just a beautiful face. She was a sorceress of extraordinary power, one of the most formidable magic users of her age. She was a queen, ruling over the remnants of her people with wisdom born from centuries of bitter experience. And she was a founding member of the Lodge, bringing to that organization not just power and influence, but also the complex perspective of someone who had watched her entire civilization slowly fade into twilight. Francesca's true name in the Elder speech was Thanedd Angliana, which translated as Daisy of the Valleys. This name reflected her connection to Dol Blathana, the Valley of Flowers, the last significant elven territory on the continent. But by the time Francesca became its queen, Dol Blathana had become something else. A valley of ashes, a beautiful name for a dying realm. The elves, the Ensei, had once ruled the entire continent. Their civilization had flourished for millennia before humans even arrived. They had built cities of impossible beauty, developed magic to heights humans would never match, created art and literature and philosophy that defined culture itself. They were the elder race, the first children, the rightful inheritors of the world. And then humans came, and humans bred, and humans spread like a plague across lands the elves had held sacred. The humans were short-lived but prolific, producing generation after generation, while the long-lived elves had few children. The humans were adaptable, learning quickly, copying elven knowledge, and then developing it in directions the elves had never considered. The humans were numerous, endlessly numerous, a tide that could not be stopped. War followed. The elves fought to preserve their lands, but they were fighting demographics as much as armies. Even when they won battles, they lost the broader conflict. Slowly, inexorably, they were pushed back, their territories shrinking, their cities falling to human occupation or being abandoned to ruin. What had once been an empire became a collection of isolated communities. And those communities dwindled year by year, the elven population dropping toward a point from which there could be no recovery. Francesca had watched this happen. She was old, even by elven standards, and she had lived through generations of loss. She had seen friends die, children fail to be born, cities turn to dust. She understood, better than most, that her people were facing extinction, and she was determined to prevent that, no matter what it cost. In her youth, Francesca had been impulsive, believing in direct action over careful diplomacy. She had rushed headlong into fights, trusting in the righteousness of her cause and the superiority of elven magic. But a lifetime of mistakes had taught her hard lessons. She learned patience, she learned to think strategically, to play the long game, to make alliances even with those she hated if it served the greater purpose of preserving her people. This transformation had been so complete that it would have horrified her father. He had been a proud elf, a warrior who had fought the humans with courage and conviction. He never would have agreed to what Francesca eventually did. But he was long dead, and Francesca bore the responsibility of leading the Thanedd alone. The opportunity she had been waiting for came during the Thanedd coup. As the Brotherhood of Sorcerers tore itself apart, Francesca made a choice that would define her legacy forever. She sided with Nilfgaard. Emperor Emhyr var Emreis made her an offer. In exchange for Francesca's help during the coup, in exchange for her support of Nilfgaard's war effort, the Emperor would grant the elves something they had not possessed in generations: their own kingdom. Dol Blathanna would become the free elven state, a territory where elves ruled themselves under nominal Nilfgaardian protection. It was not true freedom, of course. Emhyr was a master manipulator, and he understood that by creating Dol Blathanna, he was buying elven cooperation cheaply. Francesca would rule, yes, but she would rule at his pleasure. The free elves would have autonomy, yes, but it was the autonomy of a puppet state. And in exchange for this illusion of sovereignty, Emhyr gained elven magic users to bolster his forces, elven guerrillas who would continue to harass the northern kingdoms, and the propaganda victory of presenting himself as the liberator of oppressed peoples. Francesca knew all this. She understood exactly what Emhyr was doing, but she made the bargain anyway because the quasi-tuar alternative was extinction. Better to compromise, to bend, to accept humiliation, than to let the last remnants of her people disappear entirely from the world. At Thanedd, Francesca played her part. She opened the entrance that allowed Scoia'tael forces to storm the island. She facilitated the assault that shattered the Brotherhood and led to so many deaths. And when the chaos ended, when blood stained the ancient stones and bodies lay scattered through the corridors, Francesca got what she had been promised. She became Queen of Dol Blathanna. But the kingdom she inherited was nothing like the dream she had nurtured. In the Gwent card game, there's a haunting reference to Francesca inheriting a Valley of Ashes, rather than the Valley of Flowers Dol Blathanna was named for. Whether this reflects literal devastation from war or serves as a metaphor for the diminished state of her people, the message is clear. What she ruled was a shadow of what the elves had once possessed. The territory was scarred by conflict, diminished by centuries of decline. Her people looked to her for hope, for leadership, for some sign that their long nightmare was ending. And she had to rule knowing that the freedom she had secured for them was hollow, that they danced on Nilfgaard strings, that she had bought survival at the cost of honor. It was Philippa Eilhart who approached Francesca about joining the lodge. At first, Francesca was reluctant. She had little reason to trust northern sorceresses, women who represented kingdoms that had driven her people to the brink. But Philippa's proposition was compelling. The lodge would operate independently of any single kingdom or empire. It would pursue goals that transcended the current war, and most importantly, it would have a seat for Francesca, recognizing her as an equal among the most powerful magic users in the world. Francesca saw opportunity here. As a member of the lodge, she could influence events beyond Dol Blathanna's borders. She could work to protect elven interests throughout the continent. She could ensure that when the war finally ended, when the new order was established, her people would have a place in it. So she accepted Philippa's invitation and became a founding member of the Lodge of Sorceresses. Within the lodge, Francesca brought a unique perspective. She understood political realities that sorceresses who served kings had never had to face. She had lived through the fall of civilizations. She had made impossible choices and lived with their consequences. And she had no illusions about what power actually meant or what it cost to wield effectively. But she also brought her own agenda, one that sometimes aligned with the lodge's goals and sometimes conflicted with them. Francesca cared about the lodge's success insofar as it benefited her people. She would support their schemes when they served elven interests. She would cooperate with their plans when cooperation advanced her own. But when the lodge's goals threatened what she was trying to preserve, Francesca would not hesitate to work against them. The lodge's obsession with Ciri and her elder blood held particular significance for Francesca. Elder blood was an elven inheritance, the gift of Lara Doran passed down through generations. Ciri was a human child, yes, but she carried elven heritage in her veins. The prophecies surrounding her spoke in the elder speech, referred to elven legends, connected to elven history. In a very real sense, Ciri belonged to Francesca's people as much as she belonged to the human kingdoms fighting over her. Francesca supported the Lodge's plan to control Ciri's destiny, but not necessarily for the reasons Philippa envisioned. Philippa wanted to use Ciri to establish a mage-controlled dynasty. Francesca saw in Ciri the possibility of elven blood on a human throne, a way to ensure that her people's legacy would continue even if the Aeneid themselves faded away. It was a melancholy vision, born from the acceptance of inevitable loss. Francesca had concluded that pure-blooded elves would eventually disappear. The numbers simply didn't support their survival. But perhaps their heritage could endure through humans like Ciri, children who carried elven gifts even if they did not look like elves, who could access the ancient magic even if they would never truly understand the ancient culture. This pragmatic acceptance of a mixed future put Francesca at odds with more radical elements among her own people, particularly the Scoia'tael. The guerrilla fighters wanted to drive humans from the continent entirely, to reconquer what had been lost, to restore elven civilization to its former glory. They saw Francesca's compromises as betrayal, her cooperation with human mages as collaboration. Francesca understood their anger, even shared it. But she was a queen, and queens had to make choices that warriors did not. She could not afford the luxury of pursuing impossible dreams when practical survival hung in the balance. In the end, Francesca's fate was tied to that of all the Lodge's members. When the witch hunts came, when King Radovid's persecution of mages intensified, Francesca faced the same threats as her human sisters. Her beauty could not protect her. Her royal status meant nothing to mobs screaming for mage blood. Her centuries of experience could not prevent the Lodge's plans from collapsing. But unlike many Lodge members, Francesca survived. She retained her position as Queen of Dol Blathana, continuing to rule her diminished realm, continuing to make compromises, continuing to fight for her people's survival in the only ways left to her. In The Witcher 3, she is mentioned as still holding power, still playing the political games she had mastered so painfully over the centuries. Francesca Findabair was many things: the most beautiful woman in the world, a powerful sorceress, an elven queen, a pragmatic politician, a tragic figure, presiding over her people's slow fade into history. She was the Lodge member who understood loss most intimately, who knew what it meant to watch everything you valued slowly die, who had learned to find meaning in mere survival when victory was impossible. She was the daisy of the valleys, beautiful and fragile and growing in ashes. And she endured, as her people had always endured, through compromise and sacrifice and the grim determination to see one more dawn, one more season, one more generation before the final darkness fell. Other members of the sisterhood. While Philippa, Triss, and Francesca formed the Lodge's inner circle, the organization included several other sorceresses, whose powers, personalities, and agendas added complexity to the group's dynamics. Some would play crucial roles in the Lodge's schemes, others would fade into the background. All would eventually face the consequences of their membership in this secretive society. Cara Metz of Carreras was one of the Lodge's founding members, present at that first meeting in Montecalvo. She was a brilliant sorceress, particularly skilled in teleportation magic and magical rite research. Her expertise made her invaluable for the Lodge's more technical operations, and she contributed significantly to their understanding of various magical phenomena. But Kira was also arrogant and ambitious in ways that would eventually prove her undoing. She believed strongly in her own intelligence and the superiority of her judgment. Where Triss harbored doubts about the Lodge's methods, Kira embraced them enthusiastically. She saw no moral problem with manipulating others if it served what she perceived as the greater good. This attitude would lead her into increasingly reckless decisions. In The Witcher 3, Ciri appears as a character Geralt encounters in Velen. She has survived the witch hunts and is hiding from Radovid's forces, researching a cure for the Catriona plague. Her storyline offers players choices about her ultimate fate, ranging from a peaceful resolution where she finds sanctuary to a tragic confrontation where Geralt is forced to kill her. In all versions, Ciri demonstrates the combination of brilliance and poor judgment that had always characterized her. Scylla de Tansarville was another Lodge member whose ambitions would lead to disaster. Like Ciri, she was exceptionally skilled in teleportation magic. She was also deeply involved in magical research, always seeking to push the boundaries of what was possible. Scylla de Tancarville, her fellow sorceress, had been the one to suggest the name Lodge during that first meeting, though Scylla herself preferred more direct action to the careful planning Philippa favored. Scylla's storyline plays out prominently in The Witcher 2. She becomes involved in a conspiracy with Letho of Gulet, the Witcher who has been assassinating kings across the northern kingdoms. The conspiracy is complex, involving both Nilfgaardian plots and the Lodge's own schemes. When everything falls apart at the summit in Loch Muin, Scylla attempts to escape through a portal but meets a horrible end. The portal had been sabotaged with a fake magical gem, and it begins to collapse while she's part way through. Players can choose to save her, but doing so means allowing a dragon to escape and wreak havoc. If Geralt chooses not to save her, Scylla is slowly crushed to death in the collapsing portal, her screams echoing through the ruins. Her death demonstrates the dangers inherent in the Lodge's methods. They played with powerful forces, made dangerous alliances, and pursued schemes that required everything to go perfectly. When things went wrong, the consequences were often fatal. Margarita Lozantil held a unique position within the Lodge. She was the rector of Aretuza, the prestigious academy for sorceresses on Thanedd Island. This gave her enormous influence over the training and education of new mages, allowing her to shape the next generation according to the Lodge's philosophies. Margarita was skilled and intelligent, respected throughout the magical community for her knowledge and fairness. But her position also made her a target when the witch hunts began. Aretuza itself came under suspicion, viewed as a breeding ground for dangerous magic users. Margarita was arrested, imprisoned, and tortured by Radovid's forces. She survived this ordeal, though it left her damaged, and she appears briefly in The Witcher 3 as one of the sorceresses. Geralt can help reassemble. Her fate illustrates how even respected, established institutions offered no protection once the political winds shifted against mages. Position and reputation meant nothing when mobs came calling with torches and nooses. Sabrina Glevesig of Ard Karek brought a particularly dark energy to the Lodge. She was powerful and ruthless, willing to use forbidden magics that even other sorceresses found disturbing. During the war, Sabrina would commit atrocities in the name of victory, cursing entire regions and causing mass casualties. Her actions would eventually lead to her execution. King Henselt of Caedwin, whom Sabrina had served as an advisor, had her burned at the stake for what he considered treasonous use of magic. But even in death, Sabrina had her revenge. With her dying breath, she cursed Henselt, a curse that would haunt him and eventually contribute to his own demise. In The Witcher 2, players can encounter the lingering effects of Sabrina's curse. Her spirit remains bound to the site of her execution, unable to move on, still seeking vengeance even from beyond death. It's a grim reminder that in the world of The Witcher, magic can transcend even mortality, that wrongs committed can echo across years and decades. Fringilla Vigo of Beauclair represented the Nilfgaardian presence within the Lodge. She was a powerful sorceress from a noble Nilfgaardian family, deeply connected to the Empire's court and politics. Her inclusion in the Lodge was crucial for Philippa's vision of an organization that transcended the north-south divide. Fringilla had her own complex history. She had briefly been involved with Geralt of Rivia during a period when he was staying in Toussaint, trying to recover from the trauma of Thanedd and searching for leads on Ciri's whereabouts. Their relationship was complicated, tinged with political motivations on Fringilla's part, as she had been assigned by the Lodge to delay Geralt's search. In the games, Fringilla appears in the Blood and Wine expansion, where Geralt can encounter her in Toussaint. She has survived the Lodge's dissolution and continues to operate within Nilfgaardian society, maintaining the connections and influence she had always cultivated. Asaya var Anahid was another Nilfgaardian sorceress, known particularly for her healing abilities and her unwavering loyalty to Emperor Emhyr. She was instrumental in bringing Fringilla into the Lodge, expanding their Nilfgaardian representation. Asaya was also devoted to her pet cat, named Merlin after the legendary warlock, a touching detail that humanized a sorceress otherwise defined by her political allegiances. In the books, Asaya plays various roles in Nilfgaardian plots and Lodge schemes. But in The Witcher 3, she makes only one appearance, and it's a fatal one. She dies during the events depicted in the game, another casualty of the dangerous world these sorceresses inhabited. Ida Emian Ape Sivni was an elven sorceress who joined the Lodge along with Francesca Findabair. Where Francesca brought political acumen and royal authority, Ida brought specialized knowledge. She was an expert on elder blood, understanding the genetic inheritance and magical capabilities associated with it better than almost anyone else in the Lodge. This expertise made her particularly valuable for the Lodge's plans regarding Ciri. Ida could assess whether someone possessed elder blood, could advise on how to work with individuals who carried this inheritance, could explain the nuances of abilities that even powerful human sorceresses struggled to comprehend. In The Witcher 3, Ida appears briefly to advise Yennefer about matters related to elder blood and Ciri's powers. She has survived the Lodge's collapse and maintains her scholarly pursuits, continuing to study the magic that had defined her entire career. Together, these sorceresses created an organization of formidable power. They represented different kingdoms, different species, different magical traditions, different political philosophies. But they were united by their belief in the supremacy of magical knowledge, their conviction that they could and should shape the world's future, and their willingness to make difficult choices in pursuit of what they believed was right. The problem was that good intentions are not enough. Power without accountability leads inevitably to abuse. Intelligence without wisdom produces clever schemes that ignore human costs. And certainty without humility creates disasters that those who are certain never see coming until it's too late. The Lodge of Sorceresses gathered the most brilliant minds in the continent and set them to work solving the world's problems. What they created instead was a new set of problems, ones that would eventually consume them all. The grand design, controlling Ciri. At the heart of the Lodge of Sorceresses' grand vision lay one girl, Cirilla. Fiona Elen Rhiannon, known as Ciri, Princess of Cintra, child of the Elder Blood, daughter of prophecy, and the unwitting center of schemes that would shape the fate of nations. The Lodge's obsession with Ciri was not arbitrary. She represented something that appeared only once in generations, perhaps once in centuries. A convergence of political importance and magical potential that, if controlled, could change everything. Understanding the Lodge's plans for Ciri requires understanding what made her so uniquely valuable. Ciri was the last living heir of Cintra, a kingdom that had been conquered by Nilfgaard, but whose bloodline still commanded loyalty throughout the north. She was the granddaughter of Queen Calanthe, the Lioness of Cintra, whose fierce resistance to Nilfgaard had made her a legend. Whoever controlled Ciri could claim legitimacy over Cintra's former territories. potentially uniting disparate northern kingdoms under a single banner. But her political significance paled compared to her magical importance. Ciri was a descendant of Lara Dorren, an elven sorceress whose bloodline carried what was known as Elder Blood. This genetic inheritance granted abilities that went far beyond normal magic. Ciri could travel between worlds, moving through dimensions as easily as others walked through doorways. She could manipulate time, at least to some degree. She could unleash devastating power through screams that tore at the fabric of reality itself. These abilities made her the most powerful living being on the continent, perhaps in multiple worlds. And unlike most mages, who had to study for years to master even basic spells, Ciri's powers were innate, part of her very nature. She didn't need to learn magic. She needed to learn control, to channel abilities that could otherwise overwhelm her. Prophecies surrounding Elder Blood added another layer of significance. Ancient elven texts spoke of a child who would either save or destroy the world, who would be born bearing the Elder Blood, and whose choices would determine the fate of all peoples. Different cultures interpreted these prophecies differently, but all agreed on one thing. Ciri mattered. What happened to her? What choices she made? Who guided her development? All of this would have consequences that rippled across the entire world. The Lodge understood all of this. They had studied the prophecies, analyzed Ciri's bloodline, assessed her potential, and they had concluded that she was too important to be left to chance, too powerful to be allowed to choose her own path. The Lodge genuinely believed, that they needed to control Ciri for everyone's good, including her own. Their plan was elegant and horrifying in equal measure. First, they would arrange for Ciri to marry Prince Tancred Thyssen. Tancred was the heir to Kovir and Povis, one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the north. Kovir had remained neutral during the wars, accumulating enormous wealth through trade, while other kingdoms bled themselves dry in conflict. Tancred himself was young, described as having fallen in with bad company in his youth, but having straightened out after intervention by various advisors. The Lodge had already begun manipulating events to make this marriage seem natural and desirable. Shiala de Tancarville, one of the Lodge members, had been sending dreams to Tancred's father, King Esterad, subtly influencing him to consider Ciri as a suitable bride for his son. Tancred's mother, eager to see her son settled and the succession secured, was receptive to involving a sorceress in finding the right match. Once married, Ciri would become Queen of Kovir. Her child with Tancred would inherit not just the throne, but also her elder blood, her extraordinary powers. And this child, this future ruler, would be raised by the Lodge from birth. They would control the child's education, shape their worldview, guide every major decision. In essence, they would create a puppet monarch with godlike powers, and they would hold the strings. The plan had multiple layers of manipulation built in. If Tancred didn't fall in love with Ciri naturally, the Lodge would use magic to encourage those feelings. If Ciri resisted the marriage, they would pressure her through various means, from appeals to duty to threats of abandonment. If the child's inheritance of elder blood proved weak, they would use magical and genetic manipulation to strengthen it. They had thought of everything, or so they believed. There were, of course, obstacles. The most significant was that Ciri was missing. After the Thanedd coup, she had vanished into time and space, her whereabouts unknown. Geralt of Rivia was searching for her, as was Yennefer of Vengerberg. Nilfgaard was also looking, for Emperor Emhyr had his own plans for Ciri, plans even more disturbing than the Lodge's. The Lodge needed to find Ciri before anyone else did. They needed to convince her to accept their guidance, and they needed to do all of this while maintaining secrecy, for if their plans became public knowledge, the backlash would destroy them. To accomplish this, they attempted to recruit Yennefer. Yennefer had a close relationship with Ciri, having acted as a mother figure to the girl for years. If Yennefer could be brought into the lodge, if she could be convinced to cooperate, she would be an invaluable asset in locating and controlling Ciri. But Yennefer saw through their plans immediately. At that second, lodge meeting, when they revealed their intentions regarding Ciri, Yennefer's response was unequivocal. She refused to participate in using Ciri as a political tool. She rejected the lodge's entire premise that they had the right to dictate Ciri's future. And she left, opening a portal and walking through it without a backwards glance, choosing isolation and opposition over cooperation with the lodge's schemes. Yennefer's refusal should have been a warning sign. If someone as intelligent as Yennefer, someone who shared the lodge's concern for magical preservation and ending the war, found their plans objectionable, perhaps they should have reconsidered. But the lodge was too invested in their vision to let one dissenting voice sway them. Instead, they pressed forward. When Yennefer later contacted them, desperately seeking help to rescue Geralt and find Ciri, Philippa coldly refused. She made it clear that helping Yennefer was not in the lodge's interests, that if Yennefer wasn't with them, she was against them, and that if Yennefer somehow found Ciri, the lodge would simply take the girl away. This calculation revealed the lodge at its worst. They were willing to let Geralt remain in danger, willing to abandon a fellow sorceress in need, all because they feared losing control of Ciri. Their grand vision of serving the greater good had devolved into naked power-seeking, where any threat to their plans justified any betrayal. But here's where the lodge's arrogance caught up with them in the most humiliating way possible. Geralt, that simple witcher they had dismissed as intellectually inferior, managed to outwit the entire organization with a single well-told lie. When captured by Nilfgaardian forces, Geralt told them that Ciri was being held in Rhys Run Castle. The lodge, believing this information, mobilized their resources to assault the location. They prepared elaborate plans, gathered their forces, coordinated their timing. And when they arrived at Rhys Run Castle, they found nothing. No Ciri, no Vilgefortz, just empty rooms and the devastating realization that they had been deceived. The truth? Ciri was actually in Stygia Castle. Geralt had lied, and the lodge had believed him because they never imagined a mere witcher could be clever enough to deceive them. This failure was so embarrassing, so completely undermined their self-image as the smartest people in the room, that according to some sources, they later worked to have Stygia Castle erased from maps and records, trying to hide the evidence of their humiliation. The most brilliant minds in the continent, outplayed by the man they had underestimated. Meanwhile, events were unfolding beyond the lodge's control. Ciri was having her own adventures, making her own choices, learning lessons that had nothing to do with the lodge's carefully laid plans. She traveled through multiple worlds, encountered the elves of the NL, escaped from various dangers through courage and quick thinking. She was not the passive pawn the lodge imagined, but an active agent in her own story. When the lodge finally did confront Ciri directly, the encounter went very differently than they had planned. By this point, Geralt and Yennefer had been reunited with Ciri after a long and harrowing journey. They had traveled to Stygia Castle, where they had fought and killed Vilgefortz, rescued Yennefer from captivity, and narrowly survived encounters with multiple deadly enemies. The family was together again, battered but intact. And then Yennefer received a summons from the lodge, inviting both her and Ciri to Monte Calvo. They went, though both were wary of what awaited them. The meeting was held in the lodge's council chamber, all members present, though the exact count varied. Some sources suggest 11, others 12, depending on who you count as official members at this point. Ciri stood before them as they explained their plan. She would go to Kovir under a false name. She would seduce Prince Tancred, becoming his lover. she would bear his child. The Lodge would raise this child, grooming them to rule Kovir with the Lodge's guidance. They presented it matter-of-factly, as if they were discussing crop rotations or trade agreements. For the good of the world, for peace, for stability, for the future. Ciri had endured so much already. Captured by Vilgefortz, tortured, used as a gladiator, hunted across multiple worlds. She had survived all of it. But this betrayal by women who claimed to want to help her, this might have been the worst violation yet. Ciri listened to all of this, and then her elder blood powers exploded outward in an uncontrollable scream of rage and fear. What happened next terrified even the most powerful sorceresses in the world. Everything in the chamber began gravitating toward Ciri, not gently, but with crushing force. Furniture splintered as it was yanked through the air. Magical implements shattered. The sorceresses themselves felt their bodies being pulled toward the girl, fighting against a force that could tear them apart at the molecular level. The intensity was deadly. Anyone who got too close to Ciri would be obliterated, not just killed, but unmade by the raw magical force radiating from her. This wasn't controlled power. This was reality itself, warping around someone who had been pushed too far. Eredin, the leader of the Wild Hunt, who had also been pursuing Ciri and was somehow present or nearby during this chaos, tried to approach her. His own warriors had to drag him back before Ciri's powers killed him. The sorceresses, these women who had believed they could control Ciri, who had schemed and planned for months about how to use her, suddenly understood the truth. They had no control at all. If Ciri chose to resist, if she decided to unleash her full power, there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop her. They weren't puppeteers holding her strings. They were insects who had attracted the attention of something vast and terrible. It was Avalak, an elven sage who had been keeping watch over Ciri, who finally managed to intervene and help her regain control. The power subsided, leaving the sorceresses shaken and Ciri exhausted. They had just witnessed exactly how dangerous she could be when pushed too far, how little actual control they would have if she chose to resist. But the Lodge was nothing if not persistent. They regrouped, reconsidered their approach, and tried again. This time, they offered Ciri a deal. She could leave with Yennefer. She could go meet Geralt in Rivia, fulfill her promise to see him one last time. But afterwards, she would need to return and accept the Lodge's plan for her future. Ciri agreed. She would go. She would see Geralt. And then she would return. The Lodge, satisfied that they had secured her cooperation, let her go. Ciri never came back. In Rivia, terrible events unfolded. A pogrom erupted, with humans massacring non-humans in the streets. Geralt got caught in the violence, trying to protect innocent victims. He was mortally wounded, stabbed by a pitchfork-wielding peasant in the chaos. Yennefer, desperate to save him, poured all her magical energy into healing him, exhausting herself to the point of death. And Ciri, using powers the Lodge had wanted to control, took them both away. She carried Geralt and Yennefer to a place beyond the reach of the Lodge, beyond the reach of anyone. Whether they lived or died, whether they found peace or something else, remained unknown. But they were together, and they were free from schemes and manipulations. The Lodge's grand plan collapsed in that moment. All their careful preparation, all their political maneuvering, all their certainty that they knew best, all of it meant nothing. Ciri had made her choice, and that choice was to reject everything they represented. Years later, if players pursue certain choices in The Witcher 3, Geralt can arrange for Ciri to meet with the Lodge again. By this point, the Lodge has been reformed, its surviving members gathered to fight the Wild Hunt. They offer Ciri membership as an equal partner, not as a pawn to be controlled. The meeting can go well or poorly depending on how Geralt handles it, whether he accompanies Ciri or lets her face them alone. But the relationship is forever changed. The Lodge's moment of opportunity has passed. Ciri knows who they are and what they wanted from her. She may work with them when their goals align, but she will never be controlled by them. She has grown into her own power, made her own choices, become her own person, despite all attempts to dictate her destiny. The Lodge of Sorceresses had wanted to shape the future by controlling one girl. Instead, they learned a lesson that powerful people throughout history have had to learn. You cannot control destiny. You cannot force people into the shapes you desire, and attempts to do so will ultimately fail, often spectacularly, leaving you with nothing but the consequences of your own arrogance. The Lodge in The Witcher. The Lodge's schemes and machinations took center stage during the events of The Witcher 2, Assassins of Kings, the video game that explored the political chaos following the book's conclusion. Here, the Lodge's influence was revealed to have extended into the very heart of northern politics, and its members found themselves exposed in ways that would prove catastrophic. Years had passed since the events involving Ciri. The Lodge continued operating in secret, pursuing their goal of influencing political events throughout the northern kingdoms. But they had learned from their failure with Ciri. Instead of trying to control one impossibly powerful individual, they shifted their strategy toward more achievable objectives, focusing on placing their influence in multiple locations rather than betting everything on a single grand scheme. One of their major operations centered on Saskia the Dragon Slayer, also known as Synthesis, a young woman who led a movement to establish a free state for non-humans in Upper Aedirn. Saskia was charismatic, brave, and commanded fierce loyalty from her followers. She seemed to be exactly the kind of leader who could unite disparate groups and challenge the established order. What her followers didn't know was that Saskia was not human at all. She was a dragon, capable of taking human form, and she was being manipulated by the Lodge, specifically by Philippa Eilhart. Philippa had placed an enchantment on Saskia, one that allowed the sorceress to influence the young dragon's decisions and actions. Saskia believed she was acting according to her own will, fighting for her own ideals. In reality, many of her strategic decisions were being guided by Philippa, who saw in Saskia's movement an opportunity to establish a Lodge-controlled state, a testing ground for their vision of enlightened magical governance. This manipulation showcased both the Lodge's sophistication and their fundamental arrogance. They had learned to be subtler than in their dealings with Ciri, to influence rather than overtly control. But they still believed they had the right to make these choices for others, that their vision justified subverting someone else's autonomy. The other major Lodge operation involved Letho of Gulet, a witcher from the Viper School who had been assassinating kings across the northern kingdoms. Letho's actions had destabilized the entire political landscape, creating chaos and weakening the structures that held civilization together. What gradually became clear was that Letho had connections to both Nilfgaard and the Lodge. The conspiracy was complex, involving multiple factions with sometimes overlapping and sometimes conflicting goals. The Lodge members, particularly Sile de Tansarville, had been working with Letho, though the exact nature of their cooperation and the ultimate objectives remained murky even to those involved. This web of intrigue came to a head during the summit at Loch Muin, a ruined ancient city chosen as neutral ground for peace negotiations. Representatives from all the major northern kingdoms gathered there, along with mages who were supposedly facilitating the talks. The summit was meant to establish a new order after years of devastating war. Instead, it became the site of the Lodge's public exposure and dramatic downfall. During the summit, the Nilfgaardian ambassador presented shocking evidence. A confession from Letho revealing details about the Kingslaying conspiracy, including the involvement of multiple Lodge members. The ambassador named names, revealing to assembled kings and nobles that Sile, Philippa, and other sorceresses, had been involved in plots that had destabilized kingdoms and led to countless deaths. The revelation was catastrophic. King Radovid of Redania, who had spent years building his power and nursing his hatred of Philippa, saw his opportunity. He immediately ordered the arrest of all mages and sorceresses present at the summit. The charges were conspiracy, treason, and regicide. The evidence, much of it provided by Letho's testimony, seemed overwhelming. Chaos erupted. Ciri de Tansarville attempted to escape through a portal she had prepared for emergencies. But someone, whether Philippa or another lodge member, or perhaps an entirely different party, had sabotaged the portal by replacing its focusing gem with a fake. The portal began to collapse while Ciri was partway through. Players control Geralt during this sequence and face a terrible choice. They can attempt to save Ciri, but doing so requires releasing a dragon that Ciri had been controlling, a creature that will then fly free to potentially cause havoc. Or they can leave Ciri to her fate, watching as she is slowly crushed to death in the collapsing portal, her screams echoing across the ruins. Either way, the outcome is grim. If saved, Ciri survives but is captured by Radovid's forces, facing torture and imprisonment. If left to die, her death is slow and agonizing, a horrible end for someone who had believed herself untouchable due to her magical powers. Meanwhile, throughout Loch Moin, other mages were being hunted down. The atmosphere of careful diplomatic negotiation transformed into something resembling a witch hunt, with soldiers and angry citizens alike turning on anyone suspected of magical abilities. Years of resentment toward mages, built up through their political manipulations and perceived arrogance, exploded into violence. Philippa Eilhart managed to escape the immediate chaos by transforming into her owl form. But even she could not escape entirely. King Radovid's forces eventually captured her, and what followed was one of the most brutal sequences in the game's lore. Radovid, remembering all the years Philippa had controlled him, all the humiliation she had inflicted, took personal revenge. He had Philippa's eyes cut out, not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, deliberately, making her suffer as he believed she had made him suffer. When he was finally done, he released her, blind and broken, believing she was no longer a threat. But Philippa Eilhart was not so easily defeated. Even blind, she remained dangerous. She managed to escape Radovid's custody, though the details of how varied depending on the player's choices. Her subsequent story would continue in The Witcher 3, where she would play a significant role despite her disability. The Loch Moin summit marked the effective end of the Lodge as an organized force. Their secrets had been exposed, their conspiracies revealed. Their members were dead, captured, or in hiding. The organization that had sought to control kingdoms from the shadows found itself scattered and powerless. But perhaps more significantly, the summit demonstrated how the Lodge's own methods had created the conditions for their downfall. They had operated in secrecy, making alliances with dangerous individuals like Letho, pursuing schemes that required everything to go perfectly. When things went wrong, when betrayals occurred and secrets were revealed, they had no fallback position, no public support to protect them, no legitimate authority to appeal to. They had chosen to operate as a conspiracy, and when exposed, they were treated like conspirators. The kingdoms they had tried to manipulate showed no mercy, gave them no benefit of doubt, offered no chance for explanation or defense. The Lodge had treated others as pieces to be moved on a board, and when the board was overturned, they discovered they were pieces as well. The tragedy was that the Lodge had genuinely believed they were working for the greater good. They had seen the chaos and destruction of endless war and wanted to end it. They had seen kingdoms led by incompetent or malicious rulers and wanted to ensure better governance. They had possessed the knowledge and power to make real differences in people's lives. But they had chosen to work through manipulation and control rather than cooperation and consent. They had decided that the ends justified the means, that their wisdom gave them the right to make choices for others. And in doing so, they had sown the seeds of their own destruction. The fall of the lodge at Loch Moyne served as a cautionary tale about power, secrecy, and the danger of believing oneself above accountability. It showed how even the most intelligent and powerful individuals can be brought low when they forget that they are part of a larger society, subject to the same rules and consequences as everyone else. And it demonstrated that in the world of The Witcher, there are no easy solutions, no clear paths to making the world better. Every choice has consequences. Every action creates reactions. And the road to hell is paved with good intentions, especially when those intentions are pursued without humility, without checks, without any acknowledgement that you might be wrong. The Lodge in The Witcher. 3. By the time of The Witcher 3, Wild Hunt, the Lodge of Sorceresses, existed only as scattered remnants, individual survivors trying to navigate a world that had turned viciously against all mages. The witch hunts that had begun with Radovid's persecution had spread throughout the northern kingdoms, claiming hundreds of lives. Mages who had once advised kings now hid in sewers. Sorceresses who had shaped political destiny now fled for their lives from angry mobs. But when the Wild Hunt appeared, when Ciri returned to the world pursued by interdimensional elves seeking to capture her and exploit her powers, the surviving lodge members recognized that the threat transcended old grudges and past betrayals. The Wild Hunt was coming to consume everything, and only by standing together could anyone hope to stop them. Geralt of Rivia found himself in the unlikely position of reassembling the lodge. Not because he trusted them or forgave what they had tried to do to Ciri, but because he needed their power and knowledge to protect his adopted daughter. He traveled across the continent, locating the scattered sorceresses and convincing them to join the fight. Philippa Eilhart had survived her ordeal at Radovid's hands, though she remained blind. She had been trapped in her owl form for a time, held by a merchant who had discovered her identity, but chose to imprison her with a dimeritium band rather than turn her in for execution. Geralt freed her, and Philippa, despite her blindness, remained as formidable and manipulative as ever. Her first priority was regaining her sight. Philippa had developed a magical ritual that could restore her eyes, but it required rare components and specific conditions. Geralt assisted with this, though their cooperation was tense, neither forgetting their past conflicts. Once she could see again, Philippa became a valuable if unsettling ally in the fight against the Wild Hunt. But Philippa being Philippa, she had her own agenda even in the midst of this crisis. She sought to recover the Sunstone, an ancient artifact that could be used to trap or manipulate the Wild Hunt. And beyond that immediate goal, she was already thinking ahead to what would come after. She spoke of taking Yennefer's place at Emperor Emir's court, of becoming Ciri's advisor once everything was over, of positioning herself to shape events as she had always done. Geralt could see exactly what Philippa was doing. The sorceress had learned nothing, changed nothing. She still believed she knew best, still thought she could and should control others for their own good. But Geralt needed her power, so he worked with her while making it clear that he would not allow her to manipulate Ciri again. Margarita Loantil had suffered tremendously during the witch hunts. The former rector of Aretuza had been imprisoned by Radovid's forces and subjected to extensive torture. When Geralt found her, she was being held in a prison specifically designed to contain mages, her magic suppressed by dimeritium, her body and mind damaged by what she had endured. Freeing Margarita required infiltrating the prison and fighting through Radovid's guards. Once liberated, Margarita needed time to recover, but she agreed to join the reformed lodge and fight against the wild hunt. Her participation demonstrated the strength of her character. Despite everything she had suffered, she was willing to stand and fight when it mattered most. Triss Merigold had been leading the Mage Underground in Novigrad, helping magic users escape persecution and organizing resistance against the witch hunts. She had grown significantly since the Lodge's original days, becoming more confident, more willing to stand up for what she believed in, more capable of independent action. When Geralt contacted her about reforming the Lodge to fight the wild hunt, Triss had mixed feelings. She remembered what the Lodge had become, what they had tried to do to Ciri. But she also recognized the necessity of the moment. The wild hunt was an existential threat, and old grudges needed to be set aside. Ciri Metz had been hiding in Velen, using her magical knowledge to research a cure for the Catriona plague. Her storyline in the game allows for multiple outcomes depending on Geralt's choices. In the best scenario, Ciri abandons her dangerous research, accepts Geralt's help, and eventually finds sanctuary at Kaer Morhen, where she can contribute her magical expert to defending against the wild hunt. In darker endings, her ambitions lead either to her death at Radovid's hands or at Geralt's, a tragic end for a sorceress whose talents were undermined by her poor judgment. With these sorceresses and potentially others gathered, a meeting was arranged. Ciri would face the Lodge again, but this time on very different terms. They were no longer the powerful conspiracy dictating terms. They were refugees, survivors, individuals who needed Ciri's help as much as she might need theirs. The player's choices during this sequence matter significantly. Geralt can choose to accompany Ciri to the meeting or let her go alone. If he accompanies her, it undermines Ciri's confidence, suggesting that she cannot handle the sorceresses without his protection. If he lets her go alone, it demonstrates trust in her judgment and strength. Inside the meeting, the sorceresses make their pitch. They acknowledge past mistakes, or at least some of them do. They invite Ciri to join the Lodge as an equal partner, not as a pawn to be controlled. They emphasize that they are offering alliance and cooperation, nothing more. Ciri's response varies depending on how the meeting goes and how Geralt has treated her throughout the game. In the best scenarios, she hears them out, makes it clear that she will never be controlled by them, but is willing to work together when their goals align. In worse scenarios, she rejects them entirely, her anger at their past actions overwhelming any practical consideration about needing their help. This meeting is emblematic of the broader themes in The Witcher 3. It's about agency and choice. It's about learning from past mistakes or being doomed to repeat them. It's about whether people can change, whether organizations can reform, whether good intentions combined with intelligence and power can actually lead to positive outcomes, or whether they inevitably corrupt. The sorceresses who reformed the Lodge in The Witcher 3 were not the same women who had gathered at Monte Calvo years before. They had been humbled by suffering, tempered by loss, forced to confront the consequences of their own hubris. Some, like Philippa, remained largely unchanged, still scheming and manipulating. Others, like Triss, had genuinely grown and evolved. But the fundamental question remained: could the Lodge be anything other than what it had been? Could an organization founded on the principle that powerful mages should guide civilization from the shadows ever operate transparently and ethically? Or was the very structure of the Lodge, its secrecy and selectivity and conviction of superiority, inherently corrupting? The game doesn't provide easy answers. It lets players see the sorceresses as complex individuals with understandable motivations and terrible choices. It shows how easy it is to rationalize controlling others for their own good. It demonstrates how even after catastrophic failure, people tend to return to the patterns and behaviors that brought them to failure in the first place. In the end, The Lodge's role in The Witcher 3 is not about redemption or damnation, but about continuation. They keep going because that's what people do. They keep trying to shape the world according to their vision because they cannot imagine not trying. They persist in believing they have wisdom worth imposing on others because the alternative, accepting that they might just be fallible individuals with no special right to rule, is too existentially threatening. The Wild Hunt is defeated through cooperation between Ciri, Geralt, Yennefer, and yes, the sorceresses of the Lodge. Their combined power and knowledge proves sufficient to overcome the threat. But afterwards, when the dust settles and the immediate crisis has passed, the question remains: what becomes of the Lodge now? And the answer, as with so much in the world of The Witcher, is complicated. Legacy and downfall. The ultimate fate of the Lodge of Sorceresses was written in blood and fire, in torture chambers and execution grounds, in the witch hunts that swept across the northern kingdoms like a plague of hatred and fear. But understanding how the Lodge fell requires looking beyond their final defeats to examine what their existence meant, what they represented, and why their downfall was perhaps inevitable from the moment Philippa Eilhart first conceived of their organization. The witch hunts that eventually claimed most Lodge members did not emerge from nowhere. They were the direct consequence of how mages had operated for generations, and particularly how the Lodge had chosen to pursue their goals. The general population had tolerated mages when they seemed to serve useful purposes, when they healed the sick, protected cities from monsters, and advised rulers on complex matters. But tolerance is not the same as acceptance, and it can evaporate quickly when people feel threatened or betrayed. The revelation at Loch Muin that mages had been involved in assassinating kings, manipulating political events, and pursuing secret agendas broke what little trust remained. To the common people, these revelations confirmed their worst fears: that mages saw themselves as above normal humans, that they manipulated events with no regard for ordinary lives, that they placed their own judgment and desires above the legitimate authority of kings and the will of the people. King Radovid of Redania, nursing personal grievances against Philippa Eilhart and recognizing political opportunity, positioned himself as the champion against magical tyranny. He allied with the Church of the Eternal Fire, an organization that had always been suspicious of magic, and now saw a chance to expand its influence by leading the persecution. Together, they created an atmosphere of hysteria where being accused of magical ability was essentially a death sentence. The witch hunts were brutal, indiscriminate, and horrifyingly effective. Mages were dragged from their homes, often based on nothing more than rumor or personal grudge. They were imprisoned in conditions specifically designed to negate their powers, with dimeritium shackles that prevented spellcasting and left them as vulnerable as any normal human. And then they were tortured, sometimes to extract confessions, sometimes to provide information about other mages, sometimes simply because their tormentors enjoyed inflicting pain on those who had once been untouchable. Philippa Eilhart's fate exemplifies the horror of this period. The most powerful sorceress in the north, a woman who had advised kings and shaped political destinies, was captured and brought before Radovid. The young king, remembering years of humiliation at her hands, took personal revenge. He had her eyes cut out, savoring her suffering, before releasing her blind and broken into a world that had turned against all her kind. But even this was not the end for Philippa. She survived, adapted, learned to navigate despite her blindness. In the years that followed, she would be captured again, this time by Archpriest Villima, one of the most zealous leaders of the witch hunts. And this time, there would be no escape. Villima had Philippa tortured extensively before her execution. The details of what she endured are not fully recorded in the books, perhaps mercifully, but the implications are clear. Prolonged agony before she was finally killed. Her death should have been the end of her story, a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris and the consequences of believing oneself above normal rules. Instead, something remarkable happened. And this isn't speculation. This is confirmed in the books, in the far future sections that take place centuries after the main story. In that distant time, Philippa Eilhart had been transformed in public memory from villain to saint. This transformation was partly due to Vilimer himself becoming despised as a fanatic and heretic, his extreme methods eventually turning public opinion against him. But it also reflected how history tends to simplify complex figures into heroes or villains, saints or monsters, with little room for the messy reality in between. The life of Saint Philippa the Martyr of Mons Calvus was written long after her death, compiled in the Tratorian Breviary as a work of religious scholarship. It portrayed Philippa as a defender of knowledge and learning who was persecuted by narrow-minded zealots. It emphasized her intelligence, her service to the kingdom, her dedication to magical arts. It conveniently omitted her manipulations, her likely involvement in King Visimir's assassination, her willingness to sacrifice others to achieve her goals. The historical Philippa Eilhart was a complex, morally ambiguous figure who did both great good and terrible harm. The Saint Philippa Eilhart was a simplified legend, a symbol of resistance against oppression, a martyr for knowledge and enlightenment. Neither version was entirely accurate, but the second version was the one that endured in popular memory. Other lodge members met various fates. Some were executed like Philippa. Some died in other ways during the chaos of war and persecution. Some, like Francesca Findabair, survived by retreating into protected enclaves where they could maintain some measure of safety and influence. Triss Merigold would eventually become a key figure in re-establishing positive relationships between mages and normal society, using her compassion and communication skills to rebuild trust that had been shattered. But as an organization, the Lodge of Sorceresses was finished. The institution Philippa had created, the carefully constructed network of power and influence, the grand vision of mages guiding civilization from the shadows, all of it collapsed. The Lodge's downfall was complete and irreversible. Was their failure inevitable? Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, perhaps it was. The Lodge's fundamental assumptions were flawed from the beginning. They believed that intelligence and magical power gave them the right and responsibility to make decisions for others. They believed that they could control complex systems like kingdoms and civilizations through careful manipulation. They believed that the ends justified the means, that a peaceful, well-ordered world was worth any amount of manipulation, coercion, and sacrifice of individual freedom. These beliefs were not unique to the Lodge. They have been shared by countless individuals and organizations throughout history who believed themselves enlightened, who thought they knew better than the masses, who sought to impose their vision of the good society on populations that had not asked for their intervention. And like many such movements, the Lodge ultimately failed because they forgot a crucial truth. People are not pieces on a board to be moved at will. They have agency, consciousness, the capacity for choice. They resist being controlled, even when that control is supposedly for their own benefit. And when control is attempted anyway, when free will is dismissed as inconvenient or dangerous, the results are inevitably counterproductive. The Lodge wanted to end war and create stability. Their manipulations instead contributed to the very chaos they sought to prevent. They wanted to protect magic and ensure its place in society. Their secrecy and scheming instead turned populations against all mages, nearly destroying magical culture entirely. They wanted to guide Ciri toward a destiny that would benefit everyone. Their attempts to control her instead drove her away, and ultimately failed completely. In every major goal, the Lodge's methods undermined their objectives. This was not bad luck or poor execution. It was the inevitable result of trying to impose order on complex systems through top-down control rather than working within those systems through cooperation and consent. The tragedy of the Lodge of Sorceresses is that they were neither purely villainous nor purely heroic. They were intelligent people who saw real problems and tried to solve them. But they chose the wrong solutions that required reducing others to objects, that demanded secrecy and manipulation, that could only work if everyone did exactly what the Lodge wanted them to do. In the world of The Witcher, which is morally complex and philosophically nuanced, the Lodge serves as a perfect embodiment of how good intentions can lead to terrible outcomes when combined with arrogance and lack of accountability. They are a cautionary tale about power, about the danger of believing you know what's best for everyone else, about what happens when intelligence is not tempered by humility. Their legacy is complex. They did accomplish some good. They helped end certain conflicts, protected some innocents, advanced magical knowledge. But they also caused tremendous harm, betrayed trust, violated autonomy, and ultimately contributed to a wave of anti-magic persecution that set back magical culture for generations. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Lodge's story is one that powerful people throughout history have struggled to learn. That wisdom is not the same as the right to rule. That understanding problems does not grant authority to impose solutions, and that the best way to improve the world is not through manipulation and control, but through cooperation, transparency, and respect for the agency and dignity of all people. The Lodge of Sorceresses rose from the ashes of the Brotherhood. They believed they could do better, could succeed where the Brotherhood failed, could shape the world into something better through the application of magical power and superior wisdom. Instead, they proved that the problems that destroyed the Brotherhood were not unique to that organization, but were inherent in the very idea of a small group of powerful individuals trying to control society from the shadows. And so the Lodge fell, its members scattered or dead, its dreams unfulfilled, its legacy a mixture of accomplishment and catastrophe. In the end, they were neither the saviors they believed themselves to be, nor the villains their enemies painted them as. They were simply people, flawed and fallible, who reached too far and grasped at things that should never be controlled. Their story ended. But the questions they raised about power, responsibility, and the limits of even the best intentions remain relevant, echoing through time to challenge anyone who believes they have the wisdom and right to make the world better through any means necessary. Conclusion. And so we return to where we began, the woman who would have her eyes cut out and be worshipped as a saint. The organization that believed it could control destiny and instead destroyed itself. The conspiracy that aimed to reshape civilization and instead proved why such conspiracies inevitably fail. We've journeyed through the Lodge's entire existence, from its birth in the ashes of Thanedd to its dissolution in the fires of persecution. We've seen how Philippa Eilhart's brilliance created an organization of unprecedented power, and how that same brilliance couldn't prevent its catastrophic failure. We've watched Triss Merigold struggle with her conscience, staying silent when she should have spoken. We've witnessed Francesca Findabair make impossible bargains to save her dying people. We've seen the Lodge attempt to control Ciri and learned that some things cannot and should not be controlled. But here's the final twist, the last revelation that makes this story so hauntingly relevant. The Lodge of Sorceresses failed, but the impulse that created it never dies. Throughout human history, there have always been those who believe their intelligence, their vision, their understanding of what needs to be done gives them the right to make choices for others. There have always been secret cabals, shadow councils, groups of powerful individuals convinced that the masses cannot be trusted with their own governance. The Lodge's story is a warning about what happens when that impulse goes unchecked, when intelligence isn't tempered with humility, when power isn't balanced with accountability, when good intentions become a justification for any means necessary. The historical Philippa Eilhart was a complex, morally ambiguous figure who did both great good and terrible harm. The Saint Philippa Eilhart was a simplified legend, a symbol of resistance against oppression, a martyr for knowledge and enlightenment. Neither version was entirely accurate, but the second version was the one that endured in popular memory. Even in her martyrdom, even in the way history remembered her, Philippa's story became another manipulation, another version of events shaped to serve, a narrative, rather than reveal truth. And perhaps that's the most fitting legacy for the Lodge of Sorceresses. They wanted to control the future. Instead, they couldn't even control their own story. If you found this journey through the Lodge's history interesting, consider subscribing to the channel and letting me know in the comments what other aspects of Witcher lore you'd like to explore. There are so many stories in this rich, complex world, so many characters whose tales deserve to be told in full. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful, and may you wake refreshed and ready for whatever adventures await. Good night.